Hi, I'm Dr. D. Leitner, and welcome to the Doctor's Den, where I interview friends and former students to hear their stories, learn from their personal and professional growth, and hear about how they are engaging politics, strategy, and leadership in their everyday lives. So join us as we deep dive into the lives of everyday people and try to learn some important lessons along the way. Welcome to the Doctor's Den. Hey, welcome back to the Doctor's Den. Today we are hosting Naomi Fein. She is the Director of Business Operations for the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, and she has worked for federations for the past 9 years. She also has worked as a Jewish communal worker for the past 2 decades. She works for Jewish nonprofits in Maryland, New York, Israel, and Cleveland. She considers herself a Jewish communal worker at heart and brings her skills to operational management in the Jewish community. But more importantly, she's a mother of 4 beautiful boys and 11-year-old fur baby, and she is the wife of a rabbi and teacher who is a very close friend of mine, a day school teacher, and in a shul in suburban Maryland. And the way she says it, I think that I lend a hand in his roles sometimes too, and he does the same for me. Working in Jewish community is not just a full-time job, it's a full family job. Naomi, thank you for being with me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, how did you get to doing what you do? Where did you start out, and what sort of brought you to the place that you're at today?
Sure. So, it's been a journey from birth, basically. I grew up in a home where my mom was also a Jewish communal worker for, I'd say, the first half of my life, and then she left working in the Jewish community. And so I saw that as an example for a long time, and it was something I was interested in. I also was really engaged with people in my community, leaders in my community who were working in the Jewish community, not in a rabbi position. I think when we think often about Jewish communal workers, we think about the rabbis and the teachers, and I was really interested from a very young age in the people who were holding other positions. One person in particular had a pretty big impact on my life. He ran the Board of Jewish Education for most of my childhood, and I was like, oh, that's a thing? You can do something else besides be a rabbi or a teacher. That's cool. And then kind of from there, as I got older, you actually came into my life in the same time that this all started, which is after... When I was in college, I did a pre-social work degree, and knew that I had done an internship where I was working with doctors and therapists who treat patients, realized it was not for me. I wanted to be on the back end. And so for many reasons, my husband and I moved to Israel, and we were already married at the time. And when I was there, realized I wanted to bring the pre-social work piece to the forefront and kind of merge it with my love of working in the Jewish community that I was starting to grow. And I found a program at Yeshiva University in Jewish communal service, essentially. I like to say it's like the Federation degree, but it's nonprofit management. And so I think the degree was officially called something like Jewish Philanthropic Services or something like that. I can't remember the exact title, but it's commonly referred to as nonprofit management in the Jewish community. And it was through the School of Social Work, and it was the back end, the management side piece of it. And that's where I kind of got started. And funny enough, when we were living in Israel, that's when I was introduced to you. You had known Nate, my husband, already for a while, and we're really close. And you became our family there, or I think you were already his, but became my family too.
That's so true.
There. And so it was interesting. I was listening to actually what you were doing, what was going on in your life at the time, and what you were kind of pursuing, and also what was around you and happening, and then also your wife. I was hearing what kind of work she was doing, and I was exploring through friends and family and hearing what paths they were taking, and I started to realize that I can kind of bring different points of my background, my exposure to Jewish communal work, my interest in supporting the Jewish community, and then my interest in social work, or at least the backside of social work, the administrative side of social work together. And so that's kind of how I got started.
So you didn't know you necessarily wanted to go into what you're doing or into the Jewish world necessarily, but you sort of had that as like a major thing that you saw as that's something which I find of interest. And then as you were seeing all the other things come together, you said, wow, I can mix what I'm doing in terms of social work with this thing that I love and would love to be doing. And together you sort of brought all that into one, I would say, fold and said, I can actually make this into a job unto itself. And there's a world out there of management that I didn't even know existed as a kid, because what kid knows what's going on behind the scenes in, their shul or their Jewish community, but all this stuff is happening in the background. So I think a lot of people just don't have a clue what goes on in the background behind the scenes. Can you give us like a glimpse behind the scenes, a little bit of like, what does it mean to be on the management side of a Jewish community? You're the director of operations. Like, what does that mean? And what does it mean for the Jewish community? What's the connection?
Yeah. So the Jewish community or the Jewish Federation or any Jewish organization is like any other company, Jewish or not. It has operational needs. You have to pay the people that work for you, so you need payroll. You have to hopefully provide them with benefits, so you need some sort of benefit administration. You have to have technology to make sure, especially in this day and age, to get all of your work done, and systems that need to be taken care of. You also have, what I focus on a lot is risk management. Jewish organizations, like any company, for-profit or not-for-profit, have risks that they have to manage. You have insurance, general liability insurance, etc., in that range, to help you mitigate your risks, and then you also have insurance when you can't always mitigate your risks, to help provide some coverage, etc. Finance, accounting, all of those are functions that exist in any company, Jewish, nonprofit, or not. And so behind the scenes of any company, that needs to happen. And so I just happen to specialize in trying to establish systems and operations that are of level of excellence, is what we call it, in the Jewish community, in the Federation world.
Do you think that there's a difference between what you do in the Jewish Community Federation world and what someone does in a business, in a company, or are they really just the same thing? It's just that the focus of the organization is different. Like, what would you say is the differentiation, if there is one?
Well, I have limited experience in the business world, quite frankly. Most of my experience has been in the Jewish communal world. The closest I came was to working for Yeshiva University, or the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. So I was in the university world, which is still, and because it was YU, it's still kind of Jewish communal. But it was still functioning like a regular university. So I would say it's pretty similar, especially to maybe other nonprofits. It's extremely similar. In terms of what the needs are, they're the same. Everybody needs to have accounting taken care of. Everybody needs to do payroll. Every company, organization, they need to have those things. The resources available to them to accomplish and fill those needs are very different when you're talking about a nonprofit versus a for-profit. So for example, there are for-profit companies that will allocate resources, more significant resources, to ensure that their operations are running smoothly versus a nonprofit in general. And then I would say in the Jewish
right, because they'll take some of their income to do that, right? They're going to use some of their
right, exactly.
Like I've made X amount of profit. Well, X percent of that is now going.
Overage.
You're right. It's going to go and deal with this back end stuff that has to happen. But in the Jewish world, or in any non-profit world, you really don't have profit. Like, there's not profit. Like, that's the definition here, which means you're working on almost in a deficit mindset. Okay, go for it. No, so correct me, please. That sounded auspicious.
Yeah, so it's a little bit different because I think that there's like a legal term of what nonprofit means, and I can't go into too much detail with real intelligence on that. But nonprofit doesn't mean you're not actually walking away with any profit at all. But what I would say is that no matter what, you have a responsibility, no matter where you work, whether it's a for-profit or nonprofit, to use your assets responsibly. the responsibility of your assets when you work in a for-profit is very different than a nonprofit. And so I have a responsibility as somebody who works in a Jewish nonprofit organization, and so does my team and the leaders of the organization I work for. We have a responsibility to ensure that we are using the assets where the funds come from the way that it are intended. So our donors are donating money not to pay my payroll, not to make sure my accounting system is running smoothly, but rather to enhance the Jewish community, to have an impact on the Jewish community. And so I need to take as little as possible of the funds away from that work in order to manage the operations. And so that's the difference. Where a for-profit company, that's not necessarily something they have to be concerned about. Assets, in their case, are intended for making sure that they continue to work very well and to do things to the best of their ability. Our assets are intended to make sure that we further and do better in the Jewish community. And so that's really where the difference comes in.
Okay, that's very interesting. So, I mean, it's about I think what you're talking about is stakeholders and how you look at your stakeholders. Because in a company, right, you have the people who, if they own stock, then there's the stock stakeholders, and there's your allies and the people, your partners and things like that, people who you're working with, and then you've got your company people, the people who work with you, and all of those have stakeholders, and you have your clients. Those are also stakeholders. They all have so they all want something from the company. Every one of those people wants something from the company. And what you're saying is that there are people who actually don't. The thing that they want from the company is, when I give you money, I want you to use it the way I think it needs to be used to better the Jewish community, or to better whatever it is. I mean, in our case, the Jewish community. And that means that you have a stakeholder who is actually limiting how you can use your resources. Would that be a part of how you would say that?
Yeah, I think that, or another way to look at it is that I propose, as in the organization I work for, I propose that I can do X in the community. I can make the community better in X way, and I've sold that theory, that method, to people to invest in. So they're investing in my method, and so the resources that I have, the funds that I get in that investment, need to be spent as much as possible on that method, and not necessarily on the expenses that are in addition to that method, to make that method happen. They need to be focused. I'm not sure as much, I don't like to say that like a donor can call and direct me and say, hey, I'm going to give you money and I want you to go do Y in the community. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to go do Y. That doesn't mean I'm going to take their money either. Because I'm not here to, as an organization, I'm not here to do what they're directing. If they should find an organization that does do what they're directing. I'm here to say, this is my role, this organization's role in the Jewish community. There are many organizations in the Jewish community, and when there aren't, by the way, that's a whole separate topic, but when there aren't organizations to do what is needed or wanted, that's where sometimes federations step in to help. But the point is that I have developed something that I'm doing in the community. I can think of many examples of this, but one that comes to mind right now that I work very closely with is security. Okay, so I oversee a regional security program in the greater Washington area, and we have a method for providing security to the Jewish community. People who donate to the Federation and allocate their funds specifically to security are investing and backing our method of security, essentially. And so so they're not calling and saying like, hey, I believe that this is how you should do security. I want you to do it. I'll give you money to do it. If that's not the best way to do security, I'm not going to do it the way that they say to do it.
That makes a lot of sense. It's
Where,
really
by the way, a
interesting.
for-profit might be different.
Right, a for-profit. If somebody came in and said, "Hi, I'm an investor. I'm willing to put X amount of money into your company, but I want to see the following changes in the company," you might actually see those changes taking place more radically than you might see, for instance, in the Federation. That's really actually an interesting way of looking at it. I didn't think about it like that. So, if you're doing back end, then how you mentioned security? How does security fall into that purview of what you are focusing on? How does that sort of meld with the finance and all the other things that you mentioned previously?
Yeah, so I would say it's a gray line. It's not black and white. What's back end, what's front end, and regional security for me is actually one of those areas where I dip my toes into the front end because it's obviously supporting an effort in the community. I started off supporting the administrative needs around security back in a different federation, and since over time have gotten more and more involved, and now am more involved in the front end, but the work that I'm doing day to day is very much back end work. So I'm not the person going out and, for example, offering security infrastructures. I'm not going out and doing assessments even of what security needs are. I'm sitting here making sure that the operational needs to let those things happen for the people who we hire to do those can happen. I'm making sure that that takes place. So I'm paying the bills for it. I'm
right.
Not me personally, but I'm making sure those systems are in place. I'm vetting our technology systems, things like that.
Right. Okay. So when you do this, and not necessarily just for security, when you put into place an operation, how is it that you see values? Like, it's a Jewish organization, and not all Jewish organizations are the same. But you've been in federations now for a while. How do you see Jewish values coming to play on your end of things? And then how do you see them coming out as operationally on the other side? How are people experiencing those values through what you do, I guess, is the way to ask that question.
Sure. So I would say there's two tracks of answers. First of all, the work that we're doing, everything that we do, my team, myself, on our side, allows the work in the Jewish community to happen. So the Jewish values come out on the front end very clearly. So I process donor gifts. Those donor gifts go to supporting the efforts to support the Jewish community in this area. They go to supporting schools and synagogues and programs and etc. So that's one answer. The other side of it is on the how that we are doing our work. So it's everything from our policies and procedures have values in them that might not exist in other organizations, values of Judaism. So for example, we are not open and don't work on Shabbat or holidays. Policies and procedures have elements of Jewish values. So we don't work on Shabbat and we don't work on holidays. We actually have a policy to not send emails out during that time, even between our staff who are not Jewish or between staff who don't necessarily observe in that way. And so that's one, example of how policies and procedures are impacted by Jewish values. I would say other ways are, our HR side of the work that we do. I actually had a meeting earlier today on planning Hanukkah programming for our staff. I'm pretty sure that other organizations that aren't Jewish, maybe they'll have like a holiday party because that's common this time of year, but they're not going to go into detail about planning specific, engagements around the holidays. We also, by the way, had a panel discussion around Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot about the holidays, talking about how different people celebrate and different values that come into place. And that's part of our learning and our education, our professional development here at the Federation, and that exists probably at other Jewish organizations as well. So our values come in. And then, of course, the ultimate work that we do at the Federation, tzedakah. And so we're collecting tzedakah and we're distributing tzedakah and we're following the values that are associated with tzedakah. And so we have to follow those on the back end. There's also, I think, personally, I don't know, I can't say that every single person that works in a Jewish organization feels this, but I like to think that many do and most do. There's an essence, there's a responsibility to do things in the most honest and just way as well. So one of the roles that I play as part of that risk management piece I was mentioning before is ensuring that we have appropriate controls in place in our organization, controls over our technology, controls over our financial practices and procedures, to make sure that the way that we are handling donor funds, the way that we are handling donor data, the way that we are handling the work that we are doing is secure and honest, and just. And I think that there's, for me at least, there's that value of Judaism weighing heavily on that.
Okay, that's really cool that you find even in such basic, like, on the one hand, data security is like a huge thing nowadays. Everyone, every company needs to worry about data security, but you're saying it's not just about data security. It's I take that to another level where I'm saying it's not just about securing this data. There's a Jewish value here that plays a role in why I would do it the way I do it and how I choose to engage that topic even. And that's part of what you see as part of the Federation's sort of way of doing things. And that's really, really neat.
There's just one other piece that I would mention, which is the communal element, which is that when you work in a federation, you're not just creating systems and procedures and policies for yourself. You're also trying to share your learning, share your findings, share your operational practices and procedures with other Jewish community organizations. You're supporting the larger community, not just with donations to them, but also with resources and insight and education, sharing what you know with those other organizations to help them be as secure, especially smaller.
You're saying knowledge. It's the knowledge sharing.
Yeah, especially smaller organizations who might not have the resources to be able to hire the staff that can do those things.
Wow. Okay. So knowledge sharing is actually a really deep way, because if you think about what it means, like when you talk about tzedakah, right? There's different levels of tzedakah. There's different levels of charity that you can give, and one of the higher levels of charity you can give is not just to be able to give a person money or to be able to donate to them. It's about teaching them to be able to do for themselves, or giving them the ability to do for themselves. So you're saying you're not doing that on the interpersonal level. You're doing it like on the organizational level for the Jewish world.
Yeah. That's
really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's really cool.
If we have the resources to develop a secure cyber system, a cyber security system, and other organizations can't necessarily do that, we can share our findings, share our knowledge, and share our resources with them to do it.
Right. But I'm saying not even just, even beyond those, like, yes, those things, but also I'm assuming you're also doing it on communal planning, like people who are, or organizations that are trying to do something for the community. You're giving them the knowledge about what's been tried already, what's been successful, what hasn't been successful, how things have run, and things like that, so that they can better prepare and plan how to move forward without having to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think most people think of the Federation in that way. I think that most people, when they think about like nonprofits, especially big nonprofits like Jewish federations, they sort of see them as like the funnel for money going from here to these organizations, but not about the flow of knowledge and the flow of information that helps those organizations to succeed. But you're saying that these organizations, these larger Jewish organizations, are actually designed around the concept of raising up the smaller, not necessarily just a smaller. It can be a huge organization that's trying something new or wants to sort of branch out into a new field, and they can turn to you and say, "Hi, we know you have information about this. Please share," and that will give you the ability to do chesed, like to do real tzedakah in a really active, functional way. That's pretty phenomenal.
Yeah. One thing I will say is that one federation, and all you really know is one federation. My boss says that to me all the time. Every federation is different, but in the two federations that I have worked at, we both, some in different ways, are positioned as a central convening body in the community. And in the case of the federation I'm in now, that's often for collaboration, bringing organizations together to collaborate on an issue, on a topic, on an area. Maybe it's anything you can think of, like it could be young adult engagement, it could be COVID needs. We bring those other organizations together to see how can we support each other, how can we work together to fill any gaps that exist to serve those needs. So that's the role of a federation in its essence. And then in addition, the federation is, as you described what I was sharing before, the federation is also sharing knowledge on the back end of how we can make the work happen, what we need to do operationally to make that work happen. We're sharing the knowledge of how to do that with the organizations as well. And there's, by the way, I will say the information sharing does go both ways. There are often times where Jewish organizations in the community hear about something, learn about something, they share their knowledge with us too, and that's great. It's a communal environment. It's a communal. It's a sense of community that we all have that we bring, not just because we work in the Jewish community, we bring it behind the scenes to our work.
So I'm going to assume you find yourself thinking strategically very often. Like, you're talking operations. Now, in strategic terms, you've got strategy, you've got operations, and then you've got tactics, right? So what your strategy is ideal types, vision, like, this is where we want to go in the world. Operations is how we're going to do that, which is what you're essentially talking about. When you talk about risk assessment, when you talk about setting objectives or talking about resources and how those resources are being funneled, that's all within that operative operations level. And then tactics is really just the maneuvers that happen. But I'm assuming you find yourself working, or at least dealing with, strategic thought, where you have to go up that level where it's not just about how am I doing risk analysis, but like, what is our ideal type? What is it that we want to see for the Jewish community in Greater Washington right now, or wherever it is you are? And how does that kind of discussion take place in a Jewish nonprofit? What kind of talk happens about, I want to say, what we want our community to look like, but it's such a bigger discussion than our community, because it's all the little communities that are part of that bigger community. Did that make sense, what I just asked?
Yeah, though I don't think I'm as involved in those discussions
Okay.
as much. I think that I am involved in the strategic planning when it comes to specific topic areas.
Okay.
So if we go back to the example of regional security, I am currently staffing and so driving a committee of lay leaders. And this, I will say, is kind of the beginning of my getting more and more involved in strategic planning in the community. Most of my involvement has been on a strategy level, has been internal. It's been focused on Federation's strategic needs. But I am starting now to kind of put my foot into the water of the communal strategic planning with security specifically, and think through what are the communal, what's our intended impact. We actually use logic model at this federation. I don't know how familiar others are with that, but I've recently been introduced to it. So we identify what the intended impact is of our security program, and then we work kind of backwards and figuring out, okay, so how do we get to that intended impact?
So another way to talk about logic models, just you got resource-driven objectives. Okay, you've got doctrine-driven objectives, but there's another kind of objective, which is basically what it is that I want to see in the world. What you're saying is the logic model, and I will then, based on that, work towards, well, what kind of resources would I need to make that happen? What are the doctrinal, what are the values that we need to have come into play in order to make that thing that we see as a future happen? And so it's very interesting that you'd be using that, because a lot of people don't even know that concept, that model as a way of working exists. And I think it's really wonderful that you're doing that, because it's, to my mind, as someone who teaches strategy, it is probably the most effective way of establishing real balance between the resources and doctrine that are going to end up coming into play for success. Because if you don't do that, it's very problematic.
I was recently introduced to it, so I just learned all about it.
That's really cool. I guess the next question that I would have for you sort of goes to, there's a lot of politics going on right now in the world around the Jewish world, anti-Semitism and things like that. How are you, besides the security issue that you're dealing with, how are you feeling that in the Federation? How is the Federation sort of experiencing the shift that's taking place? And what is it meant for what you do? Besides security, which I'm assuming is a big part of that, and I don't even want you to begin talking about it because I don't think that's something you need to share. But what is it like to be living in America? I live in Israel. What's it like to be living in America right now, going through this and being part of a Jewish nonprofit, going through this change in the political sphere?
So we have to address any political need on multiple levels. First of all, there's the communal element. How do we support the community as they get through any difficult time. It's not just politics, but anything difficult. And so what role does the Federation play?
Right, COVID.
Yep, exactly. COVID was huge, where we played a pretty vital role in supporting the community and supporting the communal needs to get through COVID. So any type of political strife, same thing. It's still difficult, and it's still a role that we play in supporting the community. And so I'll kind of stop with that on the communal front, because that is where the security piece comes in, and we're still, some of that we won't get into. On the other side, where I also play a role, is internally. The staff that work here are all, whether they are themselves Jewish or not Jewish in their identification, no matter what, they're all part of the Jewish community just by the sheer fact that they work here. That makes them part of the Jewish community. And when it comes to current events, the way I see it, the Jewish community is once again under attack through what we're seeing. It's not a major attack just yet, but it's getting there. It's getting really heated around here. And we have to ensure that our community, our micro community within the Jewish community, our staff, the people that I work with, they have what they need to feel safe. So sometimes that's education. It's helping them understand what's going on, or it's awareness, helping them, maybe they don't know what's happening. Sometimes it's reassurance, helping them understand what we have in place to fight, prevent, respond to anti-Semitism and the current events. And it's our job, both on the operations side, I team up with our HR director all the time on this topic now, to support our staff, support our community as members of the Jewish community.
Okay, so that is, I think, a very important point, is that you're saying it doesn't matter to you whether the people are Jewish or not. The moment someone is working for the Federation, they are part of the Jewish community by the fact that they're supporting the Jewish community. And therefore, it's important that they feel like the Jewish community cares about their well-being and their safety and security, but also their mental well-being in relation to the changes that are taking place in the international, in the political sphere. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yeah, there are different ways to be part of a community. By my Naomi Fein loose definition, this is not necessarily like a token definition that all people who are similar to me would necessarily agree with, but you can be part of the Jewish community by birth. You can be part of the Jewish community by marriage. You can be part of the Jewish community by friendship. You can be part of the Jewish community by working in the Jewish community. If you are connected to the Jewish community, if you are supporting the Jewish community, if you are participating in some way in the Jewish community, that makes you a member of this community. I'm not saying halacha, you're Jewish. I'm saying you are part of the community, and there is a difference there between being halachically Jewish and being a member of the community, and at least in my personal opinion. And that's how I view the work that I do.
That's really interesting. I'm part of an organization called the Jewish Peoplehood Coalition. And I know that there are a lot of Federation members who are also part of the coalition. And a big part of it is, one of the major discussions that take place is, who falls within the umbrella? Who are the people who fall under the umbrella of not necessarily who's a Jew, but who is part of Jewish Peoplehood? And what you're saying is that Jewish Peoplehood is not just about the people who are Jewish, but it's also about the people who are part of the Jewish community, even if they're not Jewish, because they are part of and participate in the sustaining Jewish life. And that's a big part of what being part of the Jewish community means, even if you're not part of the Jewish people. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yeah, it's those who participate are part of it.
They're part of the community. I think that definition, that differentiation you're making is actually really, really interesting and very, very important. It's not about the halachic perspective. And, I am modern Orthodox here in Israel. It's called the Tilumi. And I think that a lot of people who are modern Orthodox, there's a huge spectrum within the modern Orthodoxy, from people who are very, very conservative in their perspective of who's a Jew and what it means to be a Jew, or what it means to support or not support gay and lesbian rights. It's a huge topic here in Israel right now, for instance. And then you've got people who identify as modern Orthodox, and yet are very pro, it's from their perspective, it's not about the halacha, it's about the communal side, it's about the human side of things. And it's about saying, but these are humans who have feelings and emotions and are dealing with something. And so what you're saying is there's two different ways to look at it. You can look at it as, who are we as a people? But you're also saying, but we can also look at it as, who are we as a community? And who supports our community and who's part of our community? And using, I think, that differentiation between who's part of the people and who, that small change makes a huge impact on what you're capable of discussing and who you're able to talk with and ally with in terms of making things possible in the Jewish world.
You mentioned earlier about thinking about the work that I do through the lens of stakeholders, and I actually like to think of it that way a lot. I think of the Jewish community almost like a stakeholder map. When you do a stakeholder map, you don't just focus, and I'm sorry to be so technical, this is how my mind works.
Go for it, please. It's really important. It's important. Please be technical. I want to hear it.
Yeah, so you don't just think about, in a stakeholder map, the individuals who are maybe, playing specific roles. You want to think about any person or individual or organization that has a stake in the whatever it is you're looking at. So in this case, the Jewish community. Who has a stake in the Jewish community? That is what is defined as the Jewish community to me.
Wow. I think that's a very different take than what most people would consider when they say Jewish community. Because most people go Jewish community and they go, oh, Jews. They go, oh, Jews. And it's like, no, wait a second. The Jewish community can be, non-Jewish people who are part of the security apparatus and are there doing security work. It can be people who are working in a federation who are not Jewish, but they are part of the Jewish community because they are partaking in the continuity and continuation of the Jewish community and making sure that it continues to exist and prosper in the world. And I think that community look versus the halachic side of it is a very interesting way of perhaps opening a discussion about a broader umbrella for how we think about Jewish peoplehood. Because Jewish peoplehood can include community and does not have to simply be halacha. And by saying, wait, it's halachic Jews plus anyone who falls within the Jewish community, now we're talking peoplehood. That's where peoplehood falls in. It's this plus this together. There's your peoplehood umbrella. And now, how do we deal with making sure that all of these different stakeholders are acknowledged as part of the prosperity and the people who engage in the continued continuity of the Jewish people over time? And I think that's a hugely impactful way of changing the dialogue about who is a Jew, because that's no longer the discussion. It changes the whole nature of the discussion from who is a Jew to who's a stakeholder in the continuity and continuation of the Jewish people and who helps the Jewish people prosper. Wow. So, that has huge ramifications on a lot of other things, though.
My chiddush of the day.
No, that's a great chiddush. I think that's really important. But what's really, I think, fundamental to that is that's something which is much easier, I think, to see and say when you're not in Israel. In Israel, it's much harder to see that. And I grew up outside of Israel, so for me, I can see it. And I grew up in a conservative family, so I see it also from that perspective. I have that lens to be able to sort of draw on and understand what you're saying. But for an Israeli who was born here and bred here, never left even, many Israelis have never left, and who have been raised, modern Orthodox or Orthodox, they don't have that same perspective, because for them, it's a very fundamental sort of core issue of Judaism is not about people or community, or continuity over time. It's about being here in Israel and about, and it's not religion, it's about Torah. I think there's a difference there that kind of gets played out. A lot of people talk about religion, but it's really about Torah and what does Torah mean in our world, in our life.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to Israel, there's, I'm trying to think how to say this. When it comes to Israel, it's thought of and it's framed differently by the history of Israel and the history of the laws in Israel. Think about, for example, right of return. How is right of return defined? Right of return is defined really by religion. It's not defined by who's a member of the community. And so if you think about the formation of Israel and the formation of those laws.
I mean, it is defined by religion, but it's not, if you think about it. It's really interesting is like, if you're saying right of return. Right of return is based on, and there are people who say it's not the Nuremberg laws, because if you go through the history, the argument has been made, is it the Nuremberg laws, is it not the Nuremberg laws that give, the grandparent clause, as it were, a stake or a part in that discussion. But it's the idea that it's not religion, it's about bloodlines. But I agree with you that there's a lot here that does have fundamentally to do with religion, and yet in the Jewish community outside of Israel, it doesn't necessarily have to do with religion. It has to do with self-identity and identifying with the Jewish people.
Right, and I think that has to do with the development of the Jewish community over time. I mean, if you look at generations before us, if you go back to Europe, the community looked vastly different than what it looks like now. If you go back to pre-Israel times, the community looked vastly different than what it looks like now. And so I think that, first of all, definitions change as the stakeholder map changes. So if I'm going to go back and look at my great-grandparents and what their Jewish community looked at, what their Jewish community included, I look at the stakeholder map and I know that, it was very different and looked more like what I would say probably most people in Israel or the Israel as a whole views the Jewish community. But my stakeholder map has changed in America. My stakeholder map now involves a lot of people who have other types of stakes in the Jewish community, not just their bloodline, not just their religion.
That's really interesting. So you're basically, one of the things you could actually say is, for instance, somebody who's leaving university and is interested in participating in the community, they don't have to be Jewish. There are people out there who are looking to support Jewish life and they're not Jewish, and you're saying, that's okay. Come be part of our community and support the community, and we will not only accept you, but we will see you as part of our community and go out of our way to make sure that you are welcomed in our community, even though you're not Jewish, because you want to have a stake in maintaining the Jewish people and their existence. And what's the word? It's not continuity. It's not the right term.
Continuity of the Jewish peoplehood.
Yeah, or prosperity of them over time, like their ability to continue being around. And so if somebody wanted to join a federation, what would you say is a good way for them to do that? Like, if there are people who want to support the Jewish community and they're Jewish, not Jewish, doesn't matter, what's a good way for them to try and get into that? What would you say, like, to someone who's about to graduate or about to go to college? Have to go to college? Don't have to go to college?
All right, so you're asking how do they join the Jewish Federation, or?
I don't know if it's just the Federation, although I understand, like, that's where your core experience is, but, like, how can someone who wants to support the Jewish community, not financially, but be part of the community, even if they're not Jewish, what are some of the ways they can do that?
I think that there's a whole host of ways to support the Jewish community, things that are simple and take a minute to do versus things that are difficult and take years to accomplish. I think that simple things like how you support the community on the social media, that's supporting the Jewish community. What you're saying about the Jewish community and what you're, sharing and resharing and saying to fight anti-Semitism as an example, that is a short-lived, easy way to support the Jewish community. You can support the Jewish community longer by getting involved, finding organizations that you are align with their values, align with the work that they're doing and interested in supporting it, and get involved. See, there's always work that needs to be done. This is never going to end. We're always going to need to continue to support and better the community, do things better, help in different ways, always new areas to help that come up. COVID was a big example. Who thought 10 years ago that we were going to have to, support the world through a pandemic? And so that's one example, but there's many other examples. Get involved in, maybe you're interested, my purview of security, maybe you have background that can lend itself positively to supporting security. There's no reason anybody has to be born to a Jewish parent to necessarily be able to support the Jewish community in that way. That's a longer standing way to get involved. And yes, of course, there's the financial way to support the Jewish community. It's endless. The ways that somebody can support the Jewish community are just endless.
That's amazing. And it's not just how they can support it, but it's you're saying you're not just going to support it. The moment you do that, you're now becoming part of our community. And I think that's important as well. Is that that's important. You're saying in your opinion, and I happen to agree with you. I think that someone who supports the Jewish people, they're part of the Jewish community, even if they're not part of the Jewish people, and there's no reason to not acknowledge that communal aspect of it, even though it's not halachically sound or based in Torah. It's based on, well, we support the idea of the Jewish people. And supporting the idea of the Jewish people is a huge thing, and it's a very important thing. So I kind of want to jump away from this for a minute and sort of get back to the topic of, like, what's it like to be in a career and like, you work. I mean, you work hard. You've always been a person who works really hard. Like, I've known you for a while, so I want to let myself say that. Can you, like, give us some, like, what are some of the important lessons you sort of learned over your10? And what are some of the things that, like, you would say, if I were going back in time to Naomi 2010, Naomi 2008, here's some things I might say to her, or here are some lessons that she's going to learn along the way that if I could sort of give her a tip on them, this would be worthwhile for her to know.
I would say that life is constantly evolving, and the decisions you make at one point in your life, whether they're professional, personal, or otherwise, those decisions are impacted by what's going on around you. And those decisions are the right decisions with the information that you have at hand. And so I actually don't think I ever would go back, because it would totally change the life that I have if I went back and gave any future knowledge to how my life turns out now. My life would be totally different.
I agree with you. I give this lecture about my...
You make decisions with the information you have.
I love it. Okay, so I have to say, when I give talks about my story, because I suffer from CRPS and I'm, a disabled IDF veteran, and there's a huge story that goes along with that, and all those, like, about leadership and all kinds of other stuff. But one of the questions that comes up almost every time I give a talk is, if you could go back in time and tell yourself, don't be a stupid kid and don't do this, that, or would you change it? Would you change your life? And my answer is always the same, is no, because if I go back, I don't know what that life would look like. It would be very different than the life I'm living right now. Even with the pain, it might even still have the pain. It might still have these, but it wouldn't be the life I'm living now. And I think that that's a hugely important thing. So let me reframe that question so that it's a little more realistic. If you could walk into a university right now, or into a high school graduating class right now, and say to people, listen, here are some things that I have learned over the last 15 years of my professional experience, that if you are interested in supporting the Jewish community, or if you are interested in being a part of the Jewish community, here are some life lessons, here are some career lessons that I have learned that should help you along the way, because it's worthwhile to know these things even before you put your foot in the water, or as you're about to put your foot in the water. Does that make sense? To reframe it?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say the biggest lesson that I've ever learned is the importance of relationships. And I say that professionally too. And I don't mean just my relationship with my boss, my relationship with my colleagues. I mean, I have been impacted tremendously by networking and the relationships that I have established and built and fostered with the people in this community. It can be a lay leader that I have never said 2 words to, and all of a sudden we're connected through some effort. That relationship can go so far, to somebody that I've known since I was a child, and continue to, work together or spend time together socially, whatever it is. Those relationships really are the essence and drive how your life turns out. And so focus on those relationships. They are crucial. They will help you go whatever path you want to go down. That's first of all. Second of all, I've learned the hard way to not focus on the path and focus more on what I am doing right now and how can I be the best at doing this right now. So what I mean by that, and I say this to my kids all the time and to my husband, that I want to raise our kids with this value of, I don't want my kids to be so focused on what they're going to be when they grow up. Let's talk about it. It's fun. It's fun to dream. It's fun to explore. You want to be a fireman. You want to be a pilot, an engineer. You want to be a construction worker. All those things are wonderful. I love dreaming and talking. But let's not focus about that. That's not steer our life now. Don't take specific classes and focus your energy in a specific area of your academic life because you think that in 10, 15, 20 years, this is where you want to be. Find what you are passionate about, what you enjoy learning, and dive into that. Focus your life around that because that will take you down the path that is right for you. You don't know what that path is, but it will take you down that path. And so that's happened to me so many times over and over again. I might have taken the classes and been in a program for social work, for example, or pre-social work. It's called Family Sciences at the university I went to. But I'm not a social worker. And that's because I learned that I have other skills. And once I started to dive into those skills and try to expand my knowledge in the area of those skills, once I started to learn more about budgeting, once I started to learn more about strategic planning, once I started to learn more about risk management, etc., and the list goes on, that's what drove the path of my career development. And so don't focus so much on the future. Focus on what you find interesting and engaging and you can be passionate about now. And that will drive your future to the path you're supposed to be on.
I actually think that those two things go together because when you talk about following your passion, part of that is also finding out from people around you, through your relationships, about new things, about new places that you can focus on, or something that will pique your interest, and you go, wow, I never really thought about that. But if you didn't have those relationships, you would sort of be lost within your own, well, what am I going to do, or what do I have in front of me? But you don't have that outside perspective of, you're really good at that thing. I never really thought about how I'm good at that thing. You really think I'm good at this? Yeah, you're really good at this thing. Well, why don't you try and dive into that? Why don't you take that as a way to... And I'm assuming that at some point somebody has probably said to you, you know what, you're really good at that. You should probably learn more about that or focus on that a little bit in your life.
Yeah, the last organization that I worked at, we had a professional development program. Or I guess it was a goal planning, our goal planning for the year. And every year when you would sit down with your supervisor and start to establish your upcoming goals for the upcoming year, you had a rule. You had to pick a goal to develop yourself in an area that you already were extremely strong and you would continue to develop yourself in. And then also an area where you could get stronger, where maybe you weren't as strong. And a lot of focus in my life went to, okay, obviously I did work on both very strongly, but I really felt passionate about the area that I was really strong in. I thought that was such a great concept that I shouldn't just say oh, I'm really good at this, I'm done. I don't need to work on that anymore. I need to focus on the areas I'm not really good at. No, I have to focus on the areas I'm really good at to keep going, to keep getting better. And I think that was a really valuable lesson for me.
I think that's huge. I think that's a really important lesson because it's like the person who gets good enough at something, and you go, well, good enough is great, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't continue trying to get better. Yes, good enough is important, and it's an essential point to get to. It's a tipping point of, I'm good enough at this, so it's not perfect, and you don't need that perfection mindset, but you do need to think about, good enough is good enough for now, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't continually strive to get better at these things. And I feel like if you're good at something and it drives you, right, it's wonderful. And when people notice that, or when you're in your relationships, those things come into play on a regular basis, they are very, very good. And I know you really well. I know for a fact that you don't just apply what you've learned and what you do in your professional life. Like you said, these are things that you're trying to teach your kids. And like Hila and I are passionately in love with some of the stuff that you do. Like, you have meal plans that go, like, for a while you were doing like actual meal preparation for like a week in advance, and we were like, how does she do that? Oh my God, how does she do that? I mean, I'm assuming part of the reason you did it is because you're a working mom.
I don't know anymore.
with a working husband, and that was an essential thing for you to do, to be able to be a working mom with a working husband, and a working father and a working mom and 4 kids and a dog. You kind of need to do that, but you don't do that anymore. I understand that now you've done something a little bit different. You've actually done, like, you've taken the operations concept and gone, we're going to apply this to your actual family life, right? And you have like a meal plan that goes for like more than a month in advance. Is like, that's a little bit crazy, but it's awesome. Like, how else? I'm curious. How else do you see some of the stuff that you're learning, some of the stuff that you're passionate about? Where else are you kind of seeing that play out in your personal life? How else are you seeing things that you're good at?
Yeah. Well, Nate will tell you that I'm constantly evaluating the risks of any decision we make to the point that probably drives him crazy. So there's that. I feel like, so life's a juggle, and for us, just like many families, it's definitely a big juggle. Nate works 2 jobs, one full-time, one part-time, and I work my job, which is full-time plus. Plus being a mom and a dad, that's more than full-time as well. That's all the time. And we have to find ways to make that work. And so you mentioned before, I'm a planner, so though I try not to plan where we're going to be in 10 years, I do plan where we're going to be, weeks out, using calendars and scheduling systems and having routines. Routines are pretty essential in our house for us and for our family. So I will say the meal plan thing is helpful, but I kind of cheat in that there's 5 weeks of meals. And I just changed the dates. I don't ever change the meals. So it's not like every 5 weeks I'm coming up with a new host of a menu. I'm just rotating the dates around.
Fair, but that still gives you like a 5, like that's still a good supply of like, you're not doing pizza every week or spaghetti every week. You're doing like something different over a 3-4 week period, and now we can do this again, and it doesn't feel like, but we had this yesterday, or we just had this last week again. Like, why are we doing this? Exactly. Why are we eating the same thing again? But that's systems thinking, and that's what's so cool is like that is systems thinking. That's operative level thinking. It's not about the strategic ideal of like, oh, we're going to have everything planned and everything's going to be perfect. It's not like, no, this is how we're going to do this functionally so that it works
right
as smoothly as possible. I think that's great. I think that's phenomenal.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and I will say it did all kind of start with like budgeting, actually. Nate and I a few years ago went through like adulthood all of a sudden. Like we realized like, oh wait, we're responsible for other human beings. I guess that makes us adults, and we need to like have budgets, and we need to get our stuff together. And so some of these systems kind of came out of that process that we went through. So
you actually went through a whole like real budgeting process where like you tried to get down to 0 debt, or as close to 0 debt as possible, right? That was something you guys worked really hard at.
We did. We have no debt, and we haven't had debt for now. Son is 5 years old, so we finished paying off our debt about 5 years ago. We have absolutely no debt at all.
All right, I'm curious. What system did you choose to use as a way to do that?
So very not Jewish. We followed Dave Ramsey, actually, and his system for attacking debt. That's where the meal planning came in. And the meal prepping, because I would do my grocery shopping based on what was planned for the next month, so I could always grab like the sales and the cheapest prices on things like that. Especially the non-perishables. And, but yeah, it was really hard. I'd say we probably had less debt than most people had. But so at the time, 5 years ago is when we finished paying off all debt except for a mortgage. And then we sold our house, so we no longer even have the mortgage 3 years ago. So up until we got rid of car payments. We actually ended up paying off cars and then realizing that the expense of the cars, because they were newer cars, was too high. So we got rid of them and started buying used cars. We would only buy with cash. We paid off all of our student loan debt. We paid off credit card debt that had accrued over time. So yeah, quite a lot of debt that we got rid
that
of.
whole thing basically forced you to create systems for shopping, systems for decision making, systems for how to run your house and how you were going to use your time effectively, because that was the only way you could achieve what it was you had set out for as like the longer term strategy and purpose behind what you were doing, right?
Yep, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, have you seen yourself take some of that stuff and sort of bring it into what you're doing now in the Federation?
Definitely when it comes to planning and thinking through the risks in my risk management role and risk mitigation. Obviously, financially, I have low risk having no debt in my personal life. And so I also kind of think about that when it comes to risk mitigation. I will say I have a hard time at work. This is where it negatively impacted that my work has credit cards, because I don't do credit cards in my personal life. And every time I have a charge to do for a work credit card, I pause and say, Dave Ramsey would say, this is not a good idea. So that's not a positive impact, but yeah, but just the creation of systems and utilizing resources, technological resources, digging deep and exploring how better ways of doing things. Those are all tools and methods that I have brought to work.
Oh, that's really neat. All right. One last question, and then I think we're going to close it out, because I've had you for a little bit over an hour now. I know. I'm sorry. We'll be done really soon. I promise. When you started out, you had some core ideas that were motivating you. Like when you graduated, you had some really core things like, this is what's important to me, this is what I believe in, this is where I want to go with it. This is not the long term, like you're saying, it wasn't that long term, vision and like, oh, I'm going to be a this, but you had some core ideas that were sort of driving you for why you wanted to do what you wanted to do. How have those changed over the last 15 years?
Well, so life has changed drastically. At the time that I graduated, I did not have any children. And I think having our children had a huge impact on how you would define the motivation. So from the time I was graduating graduate school, I definitely wanted to work. I already had identified I wanted to work in the Jewish community, and I wanted to give back to the Jewish community. And a lot of that was driven by this theory of wanting to make the Jewish community better, wanting to be an Orthodox Jew who worked in a community that was inclusive of all Jews or all members of the community, not specifically only Orthodox. That was one of my driving core principles. Now that I have kids, that has changed drastically, because I want to make the Jewish community better for them. I want them to feel that whatever path that they ever choose, which of course I would like their paths to be similar to mine, but whatever path they choose, they are always can find their home, their place in the Jewish community. And so it's still very similar, but I have a little bit more oomph to my motivation nowadays. So that part has definitely changed.
So I think, if I understand what you just said, I think what you just said is, it's not that the core idea itself hasn't changed. It's not that you still want to see the Jewish community succeed, and you want to be a part of that success, and you want to make sure that there is that next generation of the Jewish community, but now it's becoming much more intimate desire for, no matter what that Jewish community looks like, you want to make sure that your children will know how to self-identify as Jews and be able to say, this is my Judaism, and it's part of that Jewish community.
Exactly. Yeah, I want my children to feel at home in the Jewish community.
Right, no matter what Jewish community you're talking about, like the Jewish community as a whole is what you're saying. I think that's really, really important.
Yep, exactly.
Because I know that in like recent times there's been surveys done where people will self-identify as Jewish, but when you try and ask them the question like, okay, what does that mean to you? They go, I don't have an answer to that question. Right? They can't identify besides like somebody in my family is Jewish, so I'm Jewish. But beyond that, they can't identify what their Judaism looks like, what it means for them. And you're saying it's not enough now to just impact the Jewish community. I want it to be a place where people, my kids, and hopefully other kids, know how to identify their Judaism and be able to talk about it?
I want them to, I want my children and hopefully other children to feel like they have a place, no matter what path that they go down. And I think this is where I go back to like my stakeholder example. My kids have a stake in the Jewish community. I want them to be that stake that they have to be welcomed into the Jewish community. And I want to create a world where that's the case.
Wow. Okay. That's amazing.
And I want my kids to identify that stake.
Right. For them to be able to self-identify what that stake is. I think that's super important. All right.
Yeah.
So I've asked a whole bunch of questions. Is there any question you kind of wish I'd asked, or that, anything you want to ask me in this dialogue before we cut it off? Or is there any question that I should have asked you that I totally missed and should have sort of spoken about?
I guess the only thing that I think is interesting to share, and then I do have a question for you, but the only thing that I think is interesting to share is that, so as you mentioned before, you're modern Orthodox, and so am I. So in my home life, that's how I practice. This is definitely my values. I think sometimes conflict with, as you kind of iterated before, they conflict with the values of the modern or not modern Orthodox community. I don't think that the community is always as inclusive as I might be portraying my values to be. And so that's definitely a space that I have to live in, where I practice a way, and I believe that the way that I'm practicing is absolutely the right way for me to practice. But I still welcome, and I still want to say I put a hug around this idea of this Jewish community that is inclusive of all stakeholders, and those are not always aligned. Those values, they're sometimes conflict with each other, and that's okay. That's the world I live in. So I think that's important to say.
I think there are a lot of people who are living in that world. And I personally live in that world as well. I think that there are many more people who are living in that world. And I want to almost say, I can't say that we're the silent majority, but we are a silent large part of the pie of people who we live in this world where we believe there's an essence to our Judaism, which is I'm going to use the word godly, and it's something which is out of our control because there are rules that we don't get to decide about. They were given to us by a deity, and we ascribe to them. And at the same time, we go, but that deity also understands why it's important for our community to be welcoming and open and able to broaden its perspective, even within the realm of, even though it's taking certain things from what we were given and saying yes and not yes but yes and yes, homosexuality is something which is usser, and that doesn't mean we don't have a responsibility as a Jewish community to find a way to make ourselves open to and welcoming to people who are homosexual and want to be part of our community. It doesn't mean we have to accept everything that they're doing as okay, but it also doesn't mean we have to...
They are part of our community.
Right, exactly. And we have to accept that they are part of our community, even though they are not necessarily following all the rules that have been handed down.
In my perspective, Halacha is separate from community. They are not necessarily the same. Yes, there's an impact. It's like a Venn diagram, basically. There's overlap between the two. But one does not, in my world, in the life that I have built for myself and my family, one does not dictate the other.
I think that's true for a lot of the
I'm
Jewish
also not
world.
the expert on the halacha side there.
No, I understand. I think that that's true for a lot of the Jewish world, more outside of Israel than inside of it, which is interesting. Not that it's not here as well, but here it's less openly spoken about, and it's becoming more openly spoken about considering what's been going on here, and the changes that have happened since the recent elections. But I definitely think that there's this essence to what you're saying, and it's a growing movement of the Jewish world to say, I can be a halachic Jew, I can believe, halachic not in terms of being defined as a Jew, but a Jew who wants to participate in halacha and in the rules.
Halachic way of life, yeah.
A halachic way of life, and part of a modern Orthodox community, and at the same time, I can include in my community and be aware of and accepting of people who don't want to follow my perspective, but they're part of the Jewish community. And that's important. thank you so much. This has been, first of all, I've learned a lot about the Jewish NGO world and nonprofit world. I think I knew that there was, back end stuff that had to happen, but I don't think a lot of people think about the fact that, like, you can join the Jewish world and not be a person who's out on the, activist out there going, go Judaism. You can be the person at the back who's like, I'm making sure that everybody's getting paid, and that's my part in the Jewish community and part of my Jewish world, my part in the Jewish world, and that's good. And it's an okay way to participate in that. I think that's really important. And I also think that
it's a needed way. It's not just okay. We need it. We need more people like that.
It's an essential framework, part of the system. You need those people.
Exactly.
And you also need the people at the same time. You're saying, I also think I learned a lot about the idea that there's a lot of process and systems that come into play, and they are all over the place. It's not just, you only find this in nonprofits or in the corporate world or in house life, but really it's like and that spectrum is a much broader way of looking at how we can adapt the different things we find in the different realms we have and apply them in other places. And I think that that's also a really important lesson, is that just because you learn something in business, it doesn't mean you can't apply it in your personal life. Or if you learn something in your personal life, that it doesn't necessarily apply elsewhere. And the relationships you have with people are going to impact that. And I think thank you so much for teaching me those things, or reinforcing those things and making those even more real, because that's what I try and teach my students also, how important it is to see the bigger picture. So thank you very much, and thank you for being with me, Naomi. This was a phenomenal conversation, and I look forward to seeing and talking to you again.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us in the Doctor's Den. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hope to see you next time.